Well, hello everyone that's here. Welcome to the online edition of the eBay's Research Seminars. Thank you for coming. For those who don't know me, my name is Charlie Roger. I'm an assistant professor here at eBay, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Raul Pacheco-Vega. Raul is from the Mexico City headquarters of the Latin American Faculty for Social Sciences, FLACSO. And he's a remarkable interdisciplinary scholar who's an expert on issues related to cooperation in the governance of natural resources, issues like sanitation, wastewater, pollution control, so on and so forth. He's published in a range of academic outlets, is on numerous editorial boards, has served as the editor of a number of academic journals, and beyond that, his website and Twitter account will be familiar to many, as they're widely read for the insights that they give into academic best practices for both students and for more senior researchers. I know I rely on it quite a bit. Today, though, we have Raul speaking about the global politics of bottled water, a topic that could hardly be more timely, given that today is in fact World Water Day. So Raul, we are very happy to have you here. And we are very happy to have all of our listeners here as well. Before we begin, I'll just say two things. One is that Raul is going to speak for 40 to 45 minutes roughly. And while he's doing so, everybody's going to be muted, so you can hold your questions until the very end. And once we're done, I'll then offer some comments, and then we'll open up the floor for discussion, at which point you will be unmuted and you can ask whatever you like. So I think that's it from me for the moment. I'll be back again to moderate later, but for now, thank you everyone, and thank you, Raul, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Charlie, and thank you to eBay for hosting me. I am so excited about being here. So I just want to see if I can share my slides. I wanted to talk to you today, and thank you so much for hosting me, about the politics of global bottled water consumption within a human right to water framework, and primarily because my work focuses, as Charlie has mentioned, I do both comparative politics and international relations. So a lot of the work that I've done on international relations is on how we can consume bottled water at the global scale. This is the international political economy of bottled water consumption exists, and it happens. And then how can that happen within a human right to water framework, given that the norm of the human right to water has been slowly but surely diffusing since 2010. So, almost 11 years onward, where are we in regards to the implementation of human right to water, and why do we still have bottled water? So I'm going to share with you some of my insight on this. If you wanted to live tweet my talk, you can do so. You can use the hashtag eBayBW, which is, obviously the acronym for eBay and then bottled water. And then you can just attribute them to me. My Twitter account is @Raul Pacheco. I wanted to thank, obviously, Charlie and eBay, and so many friends, colleagues, co-authors, and collaborators in the water world, and my current and former students, as well as funding from all the universities where I've presented in some way or another a different variation of this talk, and obviously Paris, France, which gave me an amazing context to research the material that you're seeing. I did my sabbatical at l'Institut d'Altitude d'Amérique Latine at Sorbonne Nouvelle, Paris 3 in Paris in 2019. And I am really grateful to Yashel for their generosity in hosting me and funding, and just Paris is fantastic to do fieldwork, and particularly fieldwork on the politics of bottled water. And I'm happy to expand on this in my talk. So there are three key areas of analysis of bottled water as a social science problem that I have focused on. The first one is on bottled water as a political and public policy problem. The second one is on the ethics of consuming and producing bottled water, which I'm doing a lot of work with Christiana Zenner at Fordham University. And then the third, the global governance of plastic discards. So what happens with all those bottles that we, after we consume them, and so on. Today, I'm going to focus on bottled water as a political and public policy problem. That's primarily. And I would like you to keep in mind that this is a phenomenon that has both domestic and international dimensions. And that's why my talk is entitled The Global Politics of Bottled Water. So that's bottled water politics. That's an actual physical component have politics. And that led me to the work of Langdon Winner with a fantastic article on in Daedalus, Do Artifacts Have Politics? And I quote, in controversies about technology and society, there is no idea more provocative than the notion that technical things have political qualities. At issue is the claim that the machines, structures, and systems of modern material culture can accurately be judged not only for their contributions to efficiency and productivity, not merely for their positive and negative environmental side effects, but also for the ways in which they can embody specific forms of power and authority. And even though these are my emphasis, it's incredibly important that we remember and that we are reminded that if physical objects embody forms of power and authority, then they also embody politics. And Charlie will be familiar with the work of Mark Warren. Mark Warren insists that issues of power and authority and of conflict are issues that are political. Therefore, my point being that bottled water have politics and is bottled water political stays. And that's the case. It is definitely political. So water, specifically bottled water, embody power and authority elements because it raises questions of who owns water, and this happens both at the local scale, with the river and lakes, and at the transnational scale as well. Who controls who can access it, who gets to enjoy its consumption, who is excluded from consuming it, how much water is allocated by whom and to whom, and this power is nowhere more visible than in the transnational life of Fiji water, for example. If you see, there's an American company that it makes money out of extracting water from the Fiji Islands, from reservoirs in the Fiji Islands. So that is an issue of power. That also raises issues of authority. Who decides to allocate water allocation and payment schemes? Who collects the water? Who collects money from consumers? And how is that money reallocated, distributed, spent, and accounted for? And who is responsible for ensuring the human right to water for everyone? This is also particularly important because the international norm of the human right to water is extremely important. It's a norm that started in 2010, and it has slowly and surely been permeating. Strangely enough, neither Canada nor the US have actually signed on to having an actual human right to water legal framework. So Mexico does. Mexico has been a signatory, and in our constitution, since 2012, Mexicans have the right to have access to water, but this is not the diffusion of the norm has not been equal. So water is a resource governance problem, and water is a commons, it's a shared exhaustible resource, which many people can access. So it's a good subject to congestion, but also it's considered a human right because of the UN resolution of 2010. So for some reason, this human right has also been shifting into a commodity, particularly because it has become a merchandise. And it has become a merchandise by being excludable and rivalrous. So this is a typology of traditional public and private goods. If a good is rivalrous in consumption, it means that whoever consumes that good, I can no longer consume it. So if you consume a liter of water, that is a liter of water I cannot consume because you have already consumed it. And if you can consume it and exclude me from consumption or from consuming water, then that becomes a perfect private good. So bottles of water become perfect private goods because they are encased, they are put into a container, and then they're sold. So they're both rivalrous and excludable. In the case of lakes, rivers, forests, land, and other forms of goods subject to congestion, they are rivalrous in that once we consume them, nobody else can, but they're not excludable unless we set rules to govern those. So the work of the late Elinor Ostrom has been precisely on how you develop rules to control the access to goods that are subject to congestion. And water is one of them. So how did we get to the point where water, a commons, a good that is subject to congestion, has now acquired market properties, thereby becoming a commodity? So moreover, can this approach work in the context of the human right to water? So my talk problematizes precisely these questions. And I just wanted to show you, we are slowly but surely consuming more bottled water. If you see in 2008, we were consuming on average per capita 30 liters per capita per person per year. This is almost 100% increase. We are consuming now in 28, the last data point I have, we consume 52.24. This is increasing slowly but surely. So we have, water is a non-renewable resource, and we have less water and we're sending it more. So this is kind of, complicated. Now, strangely enough, Mexico, the country where I live now, is the top ranked country for consumption of per capita on liters per capita per year, along with Thailand. Now, if you see in the top 5, you will see not only the United States, Italy, but also France. This is slightly weird because in France, you would think that you could drink water from the tap. And actually, in Paris, where I lived, water from the tap is actually quite good. So why are French people slowly but surely climbing in the ranks of how much bottled water they're consuming? This is also an interesting puzzle. So bottled water offers a lot of paradoxes, and one of them, particularly for those of us who study the politics of water, this is a huge paradox. Packaging mineral healing waters in the 1800s and 1700s actually democratized access to the water. So mineral waters were only accessible, which had healing properties, were only accessible to the bourgeoisie. However, once these bathing companies started selling bottled water, being able to purchase bottled water actually enabled those who were not bourgeoisie to access this special water. So contrary to what's happening right now, where bottled water is actually denying, in many cases, the human right to water, in the 1800s and 1700s, it actually was a mechanism for democratization. So this is one of the many paradoxes that bottled water brings. Bottled water is also a global environmental governance paradox because even though it should be a global human right, also bottled water has become one of the most profitable industries globally. The only industry that is more profitable than bottled water is academic publishing. And no, we don't get rich, they get rich. So academic publishers get rich. So producing bottled water to me is akin to commodifying the human right to water. So given these characteristics of water as a common food resource, the global rise of bottled water offers a second level challenge, right? Like, how can governments ensure that everybody at the subnational level can have access without blocking global industrial production of packaged water? And that's one of the questions that keeps, hovering around my head, and the one that has led to my book project. So my newest project, or my latest project, is a book of essays on the global, comparative, and domestic politics of bottled water, where I look at a series of problems that are associated with the political elements of governing bottled water. I look at bottled water as a public policy problem, which is derived from increased consumption as a result of weak regulatory regimes. It also has become a non-zero-sum game where municipal water utilities are being weakened, all the while enriching bottled water companies. I also present in the book, I'm not presenting this data in this talk, but in the book I also present the comparative politics of domestic water consumption, and I compare who consumes more bottled water between Ireland, Spain, Mexico, and France, and then what are the political drivers that have led to these increases. I also talk about, in the book, I also talk about the ethics of bottled water production and consumption, a lot about the activism against bottled water and for tap water, which are completely different campaigns, even though you would think that they wouldn't. And in the book, I look at Canada and the US, which are the two more, amenable places where I've seen activism against bottled water. That, strangely enough, there is no activism against bottled water in Mexico, and that's entirely puzzling. There's activism against the privatization of water supply, of water utilities, but not against bottled water. And that's another puzzle that I'm looking at in my research. In the book, I also talk a lot about activism in pro of tap water by students on campuses. I look at campuses in Canada, two campuses in Canada, University of Alberta and UBC, and two campuses in Mexico, in the United States, which is University of Arizona and Indiana University at Bloomington. And then I focus, obviously, I live in Mexico. I'm concerned about the rise of bottled water in Mexico. We are the top consumers per capita. So I look at the rise of bottled water in Mexico as a case study in the book as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that I've learned in the politics of bottled water at the global and domestic scales here as well. So to me, there are two interrelated bodies of politics and international relations literature that I can apply to the study of bottled water. On the comparative politics side, I'm looking at national patterns of consumption and the sociopolitical dynamics, as well as trading and the differences between bottled water markets and soft drink markets. Now, the international political economy of markets, of trading markets, is incredibly important, because what you will see is that there is an incredible flux of different markets associated with the consumption of bottled water. So, for example, what you will see is that there's a lot of exports of Perrier, Evian, Aquapana, etc. And this is puzzling because these aren't countries that are particularly water rich. So what leads countries to allow and to permit and even to foment and promote the international trading of bottled water is an interesting puzzle. I also compare domestic regulations towards bottled water in regards to extraction, distribution, and marketing. On the international relations side, and even though I'm also an IR person, I have always tried to see, it's a little bit harder to see where IR can be applied to the study of bottled water, but it's not uncommon. So bottled water can also be a source of international and transnational conflict. You can see that, for example, in the US-Mexico border. Obviously, the international political economy of global markets where packaged water trading occurs, and the non-diffusion or non-diffusion of the human right to water as it conflicts with bottled water acceptance. So this is sort of other areas that I'm looking at and thinking about. So in transnationalism and bottled water, a lot of those of you who have read my work will probably have read my work on the role of transnational non-state actors and how they can push for a particular change in domestic politics. Well, transnationalism can also be used to study bottled water, particularly the role of states in governing bottled water and the governance of plastic discards, as well as activism against and pro tap water. You will see that transnational environmental coalition building towards promoting the human right to water and towards combating bottled water they have varied degrees of success, and these can also be explained through traditional and newer IR and global environmental governance theories. So, why bottled water? Why does bottled water exist, and why do we consume it? Because it's readily available, because it's healthy and pure, because cities can provide tap water, and because we've developed a taste for it. But also, in my own contribution to these discussions, so these are discussions that other scholars have contributed to, but my own is that because there are very weak regulatory regimes, and that means that regulation of the extraction of bottled water and the distribution and sales are weakly regulated, and if so, because of this weak regulation, there's also very little in our understanding of how these regulation can lead us to change, to public policy change. Now, to me, bottled water is a ripe problem for social science and humanities research. I don't want to, go a lot into in depth, but these are some of the questions that are associated with bottled water as a social science problem, and how I and other scholars have contributed to these discussions. Now, I'm going to show you two one of the great things about doing interdisciplinary work is that even as a political scientist, I do historical work. So this is actually a historical timeline that I built based on the work of Sophie Elmhirst. And she presents a history of bottled water and how bottled water became first, it was actually popular in the 1700s, in the mid 1700s, but it became again part of the array of different water provision techniques because of the typhoid epidemic in 1905. Now, this led also to the discovery and the development of chlorination at the local level. So there were developments of mechanisms for delivery of water that were commodified on the one hand, which was bottled water, and then non-commodified, which were public, which the water utilities. Now, as you can see, this also presents the shifts in bottled water from being, a mechanism for ensuring that everybody had access to healthy water, to being popularized as healthy in terms of hydration, not in terms of public health. So in 1982, what you see is that Jane Fonda released videos of bottled water as healthy. So that led to a boom of the bottled water industry as well. Now, these also combined with the fact that packaging bottled water became a lot lighter because of the creation of polyethylene, and then because of incredibly robust marketing campaigns like Perrier. Now, this is some of the work that I've done. I'm not gonna go deeply into this, but I wanted to show you the case with Mexico. And the Mexican case is particularly interesting because though it shares similar beginnings to other mechanisms of development of bottled water, there's always an earthquake or some sort of massive pollution and negative event that leads water utilities to be concerned about the health of their city, of their citizens. What we see here is a dereliction of duty. Even though, yes, there were water mains damaged with the 1985 earthquake, which actually, ironically enough, happens on my birthday. That happens to be my birthday, September 19. Even though this was sort of a trigger event that diminished the reliability of tap water distribution at the city level, what we see is a few years later, almost 20 years later, the Mexican government starts, actually 6 years later, the Mexican government recommends to their citizens to seek safe water from private sources. This is problematic because instead of developing robust infrastructure, the government engaged in dereliction of duty, and they said after the cholera epidemic and the earthquake in 1985, the Mexican government said we no longer are able to provide you with water. You should buy, bottled water. This is a problem of collusion and a problem of dereliction of duty. So this also saw itself reflected with increase in bottled water consumption as well. Now, if you remember, in 2000, the Mexican president, the Vicente Fox, became the Mexican president, and this Mexican president became obviously the he was also the general manager of the Coca-Cola company. So that also coincided with an increase, skyrocketing of the consumption of Coca-Cola and bottled water. So correlation is not causation, but there's an interesting dynamic here. Now it's 9 o'clock, and I should probably close around 9:10. So let me go a little bit faster. But this is a conceptual model of market intervention. The model I'm looking at of market properties is the commodification of water, and it's a model of market intervention in water governance that is less focused on. A lot of the research that you will see on bottled water, on marketization of water, you will see it on privatization and marketization, the creation of water markets and the privatization of water utilities. I'm more interested in the commodification. Now, I wanted to just zero in very quickly on Mexico. How can we govern bottled water in a country where municipal water supply is not trusted, and how we can implement it? Now, to do this, I just want to address several truths. Yes, there are public health concerns, but cities are still responsible for providing safe drinking water. Now, financial concerns have also led them to privatize their water supply, particularly because of lack of ability of collection of taxes. So their fiscal sustainability is poor. Also, there is no regulatory framework for extraction, packaging, and consumption of bottled water. So this also creates, it's not only easy to access bottled water, but also their weakened water utilities in Mexico. This is something we need to fix. So is bottled water permissible within the context of a water insecure city? Well, it really depends on what you want to do, right? Like if your goal is to be a water-centric city that is, very focused on conservation, consumption, or if you want it to be a business. It really depends on how you want to think about bottled water. So the problem is that it's also challenging to use human right to water as a policy frame, even though it's an international global norm. Because at the local level, there remain questions: who pays for water, who should be responsible for paying for water, and what can we do to tackle those who abuse water consumption, and should we reward overconsumption? So also, what can we do with those who do not live within urban living, so those who are in the peri-urban contexts? These are questions that I'm grappling with in my work as well. And for example, this is Latin America in regards to access to a human right to water. As you can see, Mexico has it constitutionalized, but it's not focused on its. Most countries have to some degree an interest in implementing the human right to water, but most of them are focused on policies, very few on constitutions, like Bolivia and Dominican Republic and Nicaragua and Panama, obviously Mexico, and those are Uruguay as well. I put in the United States and Canada just for comparison. Okay, so these leads obviously to the creation of informal water markets like tankers or bottled water. Now, in the US, Canada, and Mexico, there's regulation of bottled water, but none on actual extraction. It's regulation as a food, and so this is very complicated. So this classifying it into tap water and bottled water obscures the realities of extraction, packaging, and distribution. Now, the problems with regulating bottled water in cities is that there's no clear understanding of negative impacts on water wells, nor sanctions on extractive industries, obscures the realities of ecosystem health industries, and the challenges that alternative water uses also become problematic. So to really understand urban water governance, we need to really include the bottled water industry business in the conversation. So it is a business, and we need to understand how it operates. Even if it's not the biggest consumer of bottled water, as is agriculture, it still is an important consumer, and we need to think about it. Okay, so, and I think I'm well within the timeline that we had set. Implementing the human right to water is not as easy as just diffusing a human right norm. So it's particularly problematic in the context of commodification of these vital liquids. So we need to engage in a cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary, honest discussion about what would take to modernize water supply in Mexico and the world. So this is not a Mexican problem. These, you ask people in Indonesia, ask people in other lower and medium income countries, and I mean, let's face it, this is a problem in developed countries, right? In richer countries. Look at the case of Flint. I mean, Flint has not resolved its case of pollution. Neither has Washington. Neither has Pittsburgh. I mean, there are a lot of cities in the United States that have not solved. Canada is no better. I mean, we see that the problem of universal water access for First Nations has also not been fulfilled. There's a lot of water advisories, and most of them are in First Nations communities. So this is a problem, and bottled water remains a problem and remains a political problem. So regardless of the global dimension, it's a local business and also needs to be included in the conversation. I'm also thinking about a lot of other things on my research, like governance spider webs, where there are overlapping jurisdictions and regulatory mismatch. Also, issues of regulatory capture, because Coca-Cola, Danone, and so on are very powerful companies. So how do we challenge them, and how do we make them more sustainable? It's a political problem. It's a public policy problem. Also, the creation of water markets that are informal as well. Now we have pirated bottled water. Now the bottled water that you're drinking at home may actually be, Perrier, may be, a fake. And also, issues of the ethics of bottled water and consuming ethical bottled water, like the work that I'm doing with Christiana Center in our forthcoming book. So that's all I have. And here are my contact details, my Twitter, my Facebook, my email, and that would be that. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you for all this food for thought. It's wonderful to see this issue being thought about. I think it's a really important one. It's not only important for us to be thinking about today, obviously, it's an important one that has I don't know, achieved increasing resonance and become an important issue. And I think it's important to think about it in these perspectives that you're exploring it in. I found it interesting that Canada features in the book being Canadian, because there's some things that I think you rightly pick up on, which have put this sort of in my mind, and maybe they're exclusive to Canada, that like there is this contestation over water. I know that I was brought up in a household where bottled water was not looked favorably upon. Our water from the tap was perfectly good, and my parents, when we go to a restaurant, are somewhat horrified when we order sparkling water or something like that. So anyways, there seems to be a somewhat different experience across different nations that is very much worth exploring, right? In the paper that I read in the talk, I think you're really onto some interesting variation that these different perspectives and different theories and everything that you're throwing at it is really useful. And so I guess there's sort of in my comments before we open it up, there's a couple of things that I would focus on, and I think that there's a couple separate points that hopefully coalesce into a single one. So the first one is about these like comparative versus international relations perspectives on it. And I think that broadly speaking, I probably agree that there's more of like maybe the comparative politics, because inherently you're looking at national level variation. That's going to be primary, right? And like, of course, the international relations perspective is going to be a bit less useful for understanding those questions. But I'll return to that in a second. On taking the comparative politics perspective on its own, I think that there's sort of you mentioned this at the end of in the talk, and then also at the end of the paper a little bit, and it was something that I sort of a conclusion that I came to as I was going through it anyways, which is that there's this really interesting problem in the politics here of equifinality, right? Because there's all sorts of uptake, like high uptake around the world in different places, and low uptake in other places. And the reasons for that are like very, very different. The reasons why people in New York or France or Italy, I thought was actually the really interesting case in your paper, where bottled water has really seen significant uptake, is completely different from what seems to be going on in Mexico, for instance, right? Where in one cases it seems to be very directly related to sort of the unhealthy infrastructure of water in one place, and then another one has almost nothing to do with that and is entirely related to luxury, whether it's a luxury item, and some perception of that. So two things about this. One is um, um, there's an interesting dynamic, especially once bottled water is introduced, and it might affect both of these things to some degree, which is that, so in your analysis, you're primarily looking at uptake of bottled water, right? Like that's the dependent variable that you're looking at. Now, I'm not sure that that's exclusively the case, but because you also have regulations and other things in there, right? But the bottled water uptake is there, right? But there's an interesting thing because the sort of assumption is that the system has bad water provisioning for people, and then that leads to bottled water uptake. But of course, the bottled water is actually a substitute, right? And so as a result, the fact that it exists affects that water politics dynamic in the countries, and means that, absent the bottled water, the politics would have to play out differently, right? Because it's not possible to privatize the sort of externality and then put it and then defer all of the costs to the populations actually in the way that politicians are tending to do, which can lead to less emphasis on reform of the system because everybody's using this substitute in the place of it, right? And so that's just an interesting dynamic that I mean, I didn't see it developed in here. I think it's kind of implicit in some places, and maybe it's worth drawing that out a little bit further in the work. Look, I have no idea if that's actually what's going on, but it's something that I would want to think about, right? And then another aspect to it is actually the interrelation between these dynamics. And again, I don't know how far you would want to take this argument, but something to think about, which is that even though the processes in like the Mexicos of the world versus the Italys or Spains or Frances of the world are different, interestingly enough, they're both kind of being premised on health issues, right? But they're being spun in kind of different ways in those places. In one place, the water is being perceived as unhealthy in like a very tangible way, I would argue. But then in other places, there is this sort of, even where it's a luxury good, it is kind of health arguments underpinning some of the argument there, right? So there's a similarity, even though the causal process seems to me to be different, there's still a similarity going on that's might be worth picking apart a little bit. Okay, so that's the comparative politics perspective that I think is really cool. So much to say there, and so much of what you said I think is fascinating, and I agree with. Now to the international relations perspective. Obviously, being an IR scholar, I have to come to its defense. But that said, I do think I agree with the main point, which is that relatively speaking, since the outcome is this national level of variation, it's going to be a little bit less useful. That said, as you point out, there are some perspectives that sort of bridge the gap a little bit, right? And these can be the diffusion approach that you point to, right? Which I think is really crucial, and is one of the ways in which what goes on inside the states is obviously related to what's going on outside of them, right? And I think that is a really relevant perspective, but it might not be the only one. Obviously, there's these transnational movements, which you point to. But there's other things as well that I can't really take, because I don't study water politics enough, I can't really say how relevant they are going to be, but I suppose I just would want to emphasize that this doesn't exhaust the ways in which international things can impact what goes on within states, because there's, of course, international organizations, and there's various other NGOs or other institutions, public-private partnerships of all kinds, which do shape the politics of countries in both direct and indirect ways. So I can think of, things like the World Water Council, which obviously to some degree has to have some impact on, water politics within states. Now, I know that it's sort of not really a proper international organization like a formal IO, but it does sort of have some activities going on. I don't know enough about it, but there's other things too, UN Water or whatever, right? So those things can matter in a more direct way because they'll have policies that are directly linked to water in some way. I have no idea if they have bottled water campaigns, but the other thing is that there's other international organizations that might somehow affect the policy environment, even if they're not directly in any way having policies related to bottled water. But you can imagine that IMF structural adjustment programs, World Bank programs, so on and so forth, that somehow have bearings on the regulation of sectors or on the privatization of goods and so on and so forth, that are somehow going to shape the environment in which these politics play out. And so in this sense, not to say that that is something that matters, but it's something that I might want to explore further and not sort of discount immediately, I suppose, right? Okay. So that's my somewhat qualified defense of the IR perspective. I think that the larger issue, which affects a few of these things, is that in your study, while I think that the dependent variable of like uptake of bottled water is quite well defined, and that's great. Obviously, that's the most important thing in some ways for a study. I find that if you're not clear about that, nothing gets going. But in your study, the number of independent variables, let's say, is completely open-ended. At least from what I read, right? And that's both exciting because there's so many different ways that you can go, but it's kind of difficult to talk about like, is like the international relations or comparative politics perspective like more important in some objective way without actually like concretizing these things into like operationalized variables that you want to explore. And my sense is that IR, for instance, might have something to offer, but it's difficult to reach that conclusion if we don't start to think, well, is it the World Water Council that matters, or are we exploring like the World Bank and its impact on these structures and how that might affect bottled water? And we have to theorize those mechanisms, right? In order to really say like what's going to matter. And the thing is, that could be the start of so many studies. So I hope that some of my students are here because there could be many cool projects, right? But I think that you have to sort of get that granular, right, before saying like that one perspective or the other is better or not or whatever. So anyways, so that's what I have to say, I guess, which is that the project's really cool. I think that there's a lot going on in the comparative politics story that's really interesting, and almost goes to some of the sort of historical institutionalist arguments about how the politics changes before and after this introduction of this new artifact, as you say, and then international relations may or may not have something to say afterwards, but that is pending, deciding what you really like want to focus on or what variables end up becoming relevant through the research that you're doing. So I'll let you maybe it's a good thing to let you respond to that first, and then after that we'll open it up for a more general discussion.
Thank you, Charlie. I just want to defend myself on the IR. I was an IR person. Like seriously, Charlie, you know this. I mean, We talked about this with Tom and with Liliana, and then over dinner with Jessica Green. I originally wanted to do IR. That was sort of my goal. I ended up in comparative by some bizarre reason, and may God never have Kathy Harrison or Peter Doverne fight over which side I'm more a comparative of or IR. I think both of them would claim me equally. Um, so I agree. I actually think what you set up at the World Water Council actually opens a new avenue for IR. And this is because of the work that you've done, for example, on informality and institutions. This could very well be one avenue where my work and your work could really intersect, because the World Water Council actually does have a lot to say. And all of those international organizations have a lot to say. Like, UN Water doesn't do more on bottled water for very strange reasons, right? Like it really should, as a body, it should do it. But this is interesting because when I did my field work at the OECD doesn't seem to be concerned about bottled water, which is very bizarre because they push for one particular way of market intervention, which is the privatization of water utilities. So they seem to be, their interest in water reforms seems to be on making water utilities sustainable financially. And for them, the only way to do that would be, as most of the Brookings institutions, through privatization and market mechanisms. These should be indirect. You should have at least one international organization, or at least one, whether formal or informal, opposing this view. But no, there's sort of this homogeneity that, it's sort of a little bit, and this is IR speak, it's hegemonic, right? Like the idea of water, of solving water problems remains, hegemonically on making water utilities sustainable. No word is mentioned on whether bottled water should or should not exist as a business. There's no discussion of the fact that it's a 250, 280 billion US dollar business. I mean, this is a business that is happening with water that is not being, that is being extracted and not returned to communities and I've done fieldwork in Maine, in the United States, in the state of Maine, where Polar, I forget the name of the brand, but they seem to be. This is so weird. Like, I was in Maine, and the same thing that happened in Maine happened to me in Italy, in Venice. I was asking people, do you like the fact that aqua panna is being sold in an international market? And interviewees would be like, oh yes, absolutely, we love it. People in Maine love the fact that they have a bottled water company in their midst. It's like, to me, it's so bizarre, so absolutely bizarre. Like, but it's not the only place where I've seen a company extract value and do what is called in what David Harvey calls accumulation by dispossession. I mean, it happens in Zacatecas with mining, right? Like, if you've read the work of Michael Bloomfield, it happens in Africa. Like, this extraction brings along, yes, negative environmental effects, but also is driven by the need for jobs, right? And strangely, as you may see it, I mean, bottling companies do bring jobs. So this is super interesting, and you're completely right in that the politics will play very differently. So I hope that maybe this will be an avenue where I'll be using your work, or maybe we can collaborate, because this is definitely a place where international organizations and informality really blend. So that would be basically my response. And thank you so much, Charlie, for your time and for your comments.
Yeah, no problem at all. So we can open it up for discussion. We actually have one question already from Carlos. I'm not sure if Carlos is still here. I can ask the question. which is, and maybe I'll just ask that first, and then we can move into the rest of the questions. So he thanks you for the presentation, as do we all, and he wanted to ask if you can comment on two things. One, on the environmental aspects of bottled water, so I guess the implications on the environment, the local and global environment, and then also a bit on the income side of things about whether bottled water is always much more expensive for households or whether that is a variable thing across different areas.
Thank you. And thank you, Carlos. Carlos is a really good friend from El Colegio de Mexico, another excellent water scholar, and he does water economics. So anybody who has any questions on water economics, Carlos Lopez Morales from Colegio de Mexico is your go-to guy. This is really interesting. So on the environmental aspects, there are two issues, and the one that is most visible, which is the bottled water. The bottle of water, like the plastic bottle, is very visible. So people are concerned about the fact that we are accumulating and we're disposing of those bottles of water into landfills. Now, the problem is that people forget that disposal on landfills doesn't make it any less bad, right? Like, for example, Coca-Cola has been shifting the composition of their bottle to have plant content. That's stupid. I'm a chemical engineer. I understand what they're doing. This is stupid. Like, it doesn't make it any better for recycling purposes, but it makes it better for marketing purposes, because people say, oh yes, I bought a bottle of Coca-Cola, or I bought a bottle of Dasani or whatever, but see, it has plant content. That's completely stupid. It doesn't help me at all. It doesn't help the degradation. Like, the biochemical degradation is completely irrelevant whether or not it has any plant content. It's better for marketing. Now, so that's the visible one, but the invisible one is the extraction. So for example, in Chiapas, Coca-Cola is extracting water that is not going into the communities, and particularly impoverished communities. So yes, agricultural consumption is worrisome, but it's even more worrisome when it's not agricultural consumption, when it's extraction for commodification that also has negative impacts on communities. So, this, we all know that agricultural production is extremely water intensive. That's true, but we need to do a lot more, definitely a lot more. So this is something. And also on the income side of things, this is interesting. Even with income taxes, like even with taxes on even like soda taxes and so on, what we see is still people will go back to bottled water, particularly because they're concerned that their tap water is not going to be good enough. Now, as a chemical engineer, it irks me that nobody puts like filters in their households. That would solve 90% of the problem, and still is not something that it's done viably.
Okay, wonderful. So we have another question, and that's about African countries. And the question is, in some African countries like Nigeria, bottled or sachet water is not driven by health concerns, but largely as a result of the absence of tap water completely. There is total neglect by the governments. In such context, the UN right to water is debatable. Do you agree?
I completely and absolutely agree. I mean, Dr. Olusola is also a scholar of water, and it's one of the he's completely right. Like, so this is the I completely agree, and it frustrates me to no end, right? Like, how can we force? So this is where the IR and comparative politics on the ground don't answer, right? Like, how do you, yes, the United Nations says that the right to water exists, but how do you implement it where there's no tap water, right? Like, in these cases, sachet water and bottled water are the only ways to enact the right to water. So Dr. Lusola is completely right in that regard. And this is very frustrating because there is no mechanism to really force the human right to water to be really reckoned with at the infrastructural level, right? Like, as a norm, it's pretty, it's a beautiful norm, like, but in the implementation side, it's not so good. So this is very, very, very frustrating. I find, and I agree with Dr. Lusola on this. This is very, very frustrating. It frustrates me as well, and it's true for many African countries. And Nigeria is not the only one. Like, many of them struggle with water. And uh, a scholar, a good friend of mine, told me, you should go and do some studies in Africa. And I said, the problem is that African countries face challenges that are so big, it's even more frustrating than just the challenges that we face in Mexico. And I think this also frustrates scholars from Nigeria and Ethiopia and other countries. So I completely agree.
We have one from Leslie. So just one moment. She asks, or I suppose it's possible. You mentioned that bottled water boomed in Mexico post-national disaster. Bottled water as a tool in aid organizations is common, but how do you phase this out and transfer that responsibility to the government?
Absolutely. So this is a challenge, right? And in my chapter in Farhana Sultana and Alex Loftus's book, I make this case, right? It is legitimate and ethical to use bottled water as a tool for disaster response, but the problem is that disaster response can only happen for so long, right? It's incredible that so many years after the Flint crisis, there's still talk about we should donate thousands of cases of bottled water. This is stupid. This was justifiable weeks and months after the disaster, but not years. This is completely ridiculous. So how do you face this? And one of the ways in which you can transfer responsibility is by demanding it from government. And I've studied environmental NGOs. So activism is fundamental, and civil society has a role in pushing for this transfer of responsibility. Because the problem is, if civil society doesn't push for this, then there is no change. Now, pushing for it doesn't guarantee success. I mean, you've seen it. I don't know if you remember the Miss Flint, a young girl who was doing very visible activism for Flint. The problem has not been solved. So yes, even with having a very robust civil society, it's not enough, but it is at least one step. The other one is particularly in contexts where this is not the case in Mexico, because Mexican regulatory frameworks are weaker. But in contexts where you can sue, you probably should sue. That's one. I mean, the power of legal frameworks where there's the possibility of suing should be, of lawsuits. They should be used for sure.
Well, while people are thinking, I actually have one that now that I have you captured, Ro, I want to ask it, which it does pick up on some of the things that we've just been discussing, though, and it's not necessarily directly related to the question that your book is focusing on specifically, but I think it's kind of hovering the background of a couple of these things, and one is related to this question of the World Water Council and UN water and so on and so forth. When you were describing it just now, it makes me think that this is actually an example of what Radoslav Dimitrov would call a non-regime, an international non-regime. And I wonder whether, A, you would think that that is a fair characterization of water, and B, given that it's so important and that there's, I think that if you ask anybody to sort of read reports of like future water issues or current ones or whatever, that this is in fact a major, major issue. And why is it not getting the attention, and why do we not have those international frameworks for dealing with water?
So I told this to Stacy Van der Veer and Kate O'Neill when we were having martinis the last time we had martinis at ISA, and I said, I actually think it's because climate change has taken over the discourse, the global discourse. And this is concerning because water is climate change, right? Like, water adaptation to droughts is one big aspect of climate governance. The problem is that it's seen as part of climate and not as part of water. So what I think, and this is interesting because Maria Ivanova just presented her latest book, and in her book she makes a point for UNEP, and I actually think UN water should be stronger, and I don't know how to make it stronger, but I think it should be because the fact that it's not makes it hard to push for water as a big issue. Now, Jen Allen will probably be able to tell us about the international uh, waste regime, but my feeling is that Rotterdam, Stockholm, Basel, and Montreal have managed to keep the issue of waste and hazardous waste always on the imaginary of people. For some reason, water is not in the imaginary, and this is a really interesting research question. It's one I would love to take on because, I mean, it should be, and I think that is the problem. The problem is that it's no longer in the imaginary. It's sort of in the imaginary. You see, climate change, and sometimes the certification biodiversity, but yeah, no, water is not. Water is not in the mainstream. Waste comes back. It's sort of if you looked at it through the Anthony Downs approach of the cycle of attention, waste comes back every time that there's a conference of the parties. Waste comes back, and the international regime for waste does and toxics does remain. I mean, I've participated in meetings of the toxics regime, and it still remains in sort of in the imaginary of people, but water doesn't. So this is an interesting research question as to why it doesn't.
And just as a quick follow-up to that, actually, do you think that the inclusion of water in the SDGs, I think it's SDG 6, will affect that at all in the future, or yeah?
I hate SDGs. I hate them. I hate them with my entire uh, being. I hate SDGs because yes, they're agreed upon by communities and so on. But did you know that bottled water now countries can report bottled water as compliant with SDG 6? I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, seriously, water should count towards non-compliance. Bottled water, I have had to give bottled water because I'm not a good and responsible country. So I don't know. It just frustrates me. I think it makes it more visible, but it doesn't give it enough visibility. Now, if you ask me about sanitation, it's even worse, right? Like, sanitation is one of those things where, once you flush the toilet, nobody thinks about what's happening. So there's this culture of flushing where there's, no real understanding of what's happening. So this is frustrating, but I hope it will change.
Thanks for that. Any other questions from our audience? Since there are no questions, we should bring this session of eBay's research seminar to a close. And so in that case, I want to thank Raul for sharing your research with us. Absolutely fascinating. And I look forward to seeing where it goes next. And hopefully actually seeing it presented in person at some point. Exactly, we'll go for Ethiopian food afterwards immediately. And finally, so thank you to all of the audience members that are here, those that were here. I hope that you can all join us again in the future. I'll just mention quickly that you can check out all of our events at eBay on the webpage and on Twitter. You can follow us there, and we're regularly posting all sorts of stuff about our upcoming talks and events. So until then, that next time, I hope that you all have a nice day, and please stay healthy and safe.
Thank you, Charlie, and thank you, eBay, for hosting me. And this has been fantastic. Thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure.